At my husband Arthur's funeral, my daughter-in-law whispered I should have been buried with him. Even my grandson snickered. My own son ignored me. They thought I didn't hear their plans to put me away. I just smiled, touching Arthur's casket. They have no idea what's coming. Like, share. And let me know where you're listening from as I share my story. The heavy scent of lilies clung to the air, a cloying sweetness that felt entirely artificial, masking the true, bitter smell of loss. Eleanor stood by Arthur's closed casket, her fingers tracing the polished wood. Her eyes scanned the faces of the funeral attendees, a mix of genuine mourners and those who were merely present out of obligation or curiosity. She knew which was which, even through the haze of her own profound grief. Arthur was gone. Her rock, her partner of over 50 years, had left her alone in a world that suddenly felt colder, sharper. She should have been buried with him, a voice hissed, cutting through the muffled quiet of the funeral home. It was Victoria, her daughter-in-law, her words barely a whisper but laced with such venom that they carried clearly in the solemn room. Eleanor felt the impact like a physical blow. Victoria wasn't even attempting to be discreet. She watched as Ethan, her own grandson, a boy she had once held in her arms and loved, snickered beside his mother. His eyes, usually bright with youthful mischief, now held a cold, knowing glint that mirrored Victoria's. Eleanor didn't react visibly, but a tremor ran through her heart. They thought her deaf, or perhaps too overcome with sorrow to notice their cruel game. Her son, Michael, stood a short distance away. He was deep in conversation, his back partially turned to her. He gestured animatedly, speaking to a couple of men in dark suits, clearly business associates. He avoided Eleanor's gaze, a pattern she had grown painfully accustomed to. He spoke about her, not to her. He was already speaking for her, deciding things, making plans that did not involve her input. It was as if her grief, her very presence, was an inconvenience, a detail to be managed, a memory, sharp and unwelcome, sliced through her mourning. It was only last week. She had been in the study, tidying Arthur's desk, when she overheard Victoria on the phone in the hallway, her voice hushed but urgent. We need to figure out what to do with her. She can't stay in that big house alone. Then came the chilling words. There are some very nice facilities. Comfortable, with plenty of activities. Eleanor's blood had run cold. And then, the final twist of the knife, Ethan's young voice in the background, clear as a bell. Victoria had laughed, a light, dismissive sound. Eleanor had frozen, her hands trembling, the full weight of their intentions settling upon her. They weren't just discussing her future. They were disposing of her. Like an old piece of furniture. Now, she gently placed her hand on Arthur's casket once more, the wood cool beneath her palm. Goodbye, my love, she whispered, her voice a fragile breath. The words were for him alone, a final farewell that transcended the superficiality of the room. It was a promise, too, though she knew they wouldn't understand it. Across the room, Victoria's voice carried again, a loud stage whisper directed at another relative. She's taking it pretty hard. We're worried about her living alone. She paused, then added with feigned concern. You know, at her age, elderly people shouldn't be by themselves. The words elderly people hung in the air, a blanket term designed to strip away Eleanor's identity, to reduce her to a category, a problem to be solved. Eleanor felt a flicker of something new alongside her grief, a cold, hard resolve. She was not deaf, she was not stupid, and she was certainly not a problem to be easily solved. The procession to the cemetery was a blur of black cars and somber faces. The biting autumn wind seemed to mirror the chill in Eleanor's soul. As Arthur's casket was lowered into the earth, she felt like an afterthought, a ghost at her own husband's burial. The true Arthur, the man she knew, the man who laughed, who loved, who dreamed with her, existed only in her memory now. The Arthur they mourned was a caricature, a figure whose death allowed them to pursue their own agendas. Michael, Victoria, and even young Ethan made no secret of their impatience. Michael checked his watch repeatedly, his gaze darting towards the waiting cars. Victoria tugged impatiently at Ethan's arm, urging him to hurry. Their discomfort was palpable, their eagerness to leave etched onto their faces. They wanted this over, done with, so they could move on to what they considered the important business at hand. Arthur's estate. Eleanor thought back to the quiet evenings over the last year. After Arthur had received his diagnosis, they had spent hours talking, not about death, but about life, about their shared journey, and about the family they had raised. Arthur, with his characteristic foresight, had anticipated exactly how Michael and Victoria would behave. He had looked into Eleanor's eyes, a sadness there, but also a deep understanding. "They'll think they know everything, Eleanor," he had said, his voice soft but firm. "They'll think they've got it all figured out." They had discussed their children, the greed that had slowly seeped into their lives, twisting their perspectives. Arthur had always been a step ahead, always planning, always protecting. And now, as she stood there, watching the first handful of earth fall upon Arthur's coffin, she knew they were already calculating, already planning how to divide up what they believed was theirs. They thought they understood Arthur's will, the clauses, the properties, the money, but they had no idea. They had no idea what he'd really left behind, and they certainly had no idea what was coming next. 3 days after the funeral, the air still heavy with a lingering sense of loss for Eleanor, but thick with anticipation for her son Michael, his wife Victoria, and their son Ethan. They all gathered in Mr. Hayes' law office. The room was formal, hushed, filled with the scent of old paper and polished wood. Mr. Hayes, a man whose serious demeanor matched his profession, sat behind a large mahogany desk, Arthur's official will resting before him. Victoria, ever the opportunist, had managed to position herself closest to the desk, her posture stiff with barely contained excitement. Her eyes flickered from Mr. Hayes to Eleanor, a predatory glint in their depths. Ethan, slumped in his chair, was initially absorbed in his phone, his thumb flying across the screen. But a sharp, silent glance from Victoria, a subtle narrowing of her eyes, made him snap upright, tucking the phone away with a reluctant sigh. Even he understood the gravity and the potential profit of this moment. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. His voice was calm, practiced, as he began to read Arthur's last testament. The legal jargon blended into a background hum for Eleanor, but the key phrases cut through clearly. "To my son, Michael, the family home, the entirety of the business interests, the rental properties located at," as Mr. Hayes continued, detailing the significant assets. A change came over Michael and Victoria. Michael, who had seemed perpetually stressed since Arthur's illness, visibly relaxed, a smug satisfaction settling on his face. Victoria, beside him, practically glowed. She pressed her lips together, battling to suppress a triumphant smile, her eyes darting to Eleanor, as if challenging her to react. Ethan, who had been merely present, perked up considerably at the mention of specific dollar amounts and properties. His eyes widened, suddenly much more interested in the dull legal proceedings. Then came the section detailing Eleanor's inheritance. "To my beloved wife, Eleanor, I bequeath my personal effects, all household furnishings, and a monthly allowance of $1,500 for her continued comfort." The words hung in the air, stark and dismissive. $1,500. It was barely enough to cover the utilities of the large house, let alone her own needs. It was an insult, a clear statement of her diminished status in their eyes, and a stark contrast to the millions just assigned to Michael. Michael cleared his throat, his voice smooth and authoritative. "That seems perfectly reasonable for Mom's needs," he declared, speaking for Eleanor, as if she weren't even in the room. He didn't even look at her, his gaze fixed on Mr. Hayes, as if confirming that this was a perfectly acceptable arrangement. Victoria nodded in vigorous agreement, her smile no longer quite so suppressed. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her face a mask of serene composure. Inside, a cold fire was kindling. This was precisely what Arthur had predicted. Months ago, as his health had begun to fail, he had called her into his study. He had shown her this very document, this Decoy will. "They expect this, my dear," he had said, his eyes twinkling with a sad wisdom. They expect to be given everything. And they expect you to be a nuisance, a burden to be managed with a pittance. He had wanted to confirm their expectations, to expose the depth of their greed and self-interest. He had wanted them to believe they had won, before the real game even began. The moment Mr. Hayes finished reading, Michael launched into action. Mr. Hayes, about the business accounts. What's the fastest way to facilitate their transfer? I'd like to get things in order immediately. He pulled out his phone, already making mental notes, his mind clearly focused on the logistics of acquisition. Victoria, meanwhile, turned to Ethan, whispering loudly about the house. Do you realize the value of that property, Ethan? And the rental income from the apartments alone could be substantial? She was already mentally selling, renovating, calculating. Ethan, emboldened by the prospect of newfound wealth, leaned forward, addressing Eleanor directly for the first time. Grandma, you'll probably want to start thinking about downsizing, right? That house is huge for one person. His tone was devoid of empathy, merely practical, as if discussing a logistical problem rather than his grandmother's home. Victoria eagerly jumped in. Oh, definitely, Eleanor. We've been looking at some lovely senior communities. So many activities, new friends, much more appropriate for someone your age, wouldn't you say? Her voice was cloyingly sweet, but the underlying message was clear. Get out. Eleanor slowly lifted her gaze, meeting each of their eyes without flinching. Her voice was calm, steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. I'll consider my options, she stated, her words carrying a weight they clearly misunderstood. They heard compliance. She meant something entirely different. As they walked through the parking garage, the chilly autumn air biting at her cheeks, Eleanor's ears, sharpened by years of quiet observation, caught fragments of their conversation. Victoria's voice, bright and planning, drifted back. We can sell off most of her old furniture. It's so dated anyway. And the big screen TV in the living room? That's definitely coming to our house. Ethan chimed in with agreement, already picturing his new gaming setup. Michael walked beside Eleanor, a palpable aura of relief emanating from him. He adjusted his tie, a faint smile on his lips. The burden of his inheritance was lighter than he had feared. He no longer had to worry about Eleanor being a financial drain on his new fortune. Eleanor got into her car, the engine purring to life. A small, reassuring vibration. As she drove home, she thought about the real will, the one Arthur and she had meticulously crafted, the one locked securely in their safety deposit box. Mr. Hayes knew nothing about it. No one did, except for her and Arthur. A faint smile touched her lips, a stark contrast to the grim set of her jaw just moments before. She remembered Arthur's words, spoken in that same quiet study. I want to show them exactly how wrong they've been about both of us. Eleanor, they underestimate you, and they certainly underestimate the love we shared. The game had just begun. The morning after the reading of the Decoy will, Eleanor felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since Arthur's diagnosis. She called Mr. Hayes's office promptly at 9, her voice steady as she requested an afternoon appointment. She wanted to move quickly, to strike while the iron of their presumed victory was still hot. She arrived at the law office well before her scheduled time, a leather briefcase of Arthur's clutched in her hand. It was the same briefcase he had carried to work every day for decades, now untouched since his passing. Inside, nestled amongst his old planners and pens, was a thick, sealed envelope. Mr. Hayes greeted her, a hint of surprise in his eyes at her unexpected visit so soon after the last one. Eleanor sat across from him, placing the envelope on the polished desk. Mr. Hayes, she began, her voice calm and clear. There's a second will. She pushed the envelope towards him. This one was prepared just 6 weeks before Arthur's death. He dated it specifically. Mr. Hayes's brow furrowed. He picked up the envelope, examining the seal and the date written neatly on the front. With a professional sigh, he broke the seal and began to read. Eleanor watched his face closely, noting the subtle shifts in his expression. Initial confusion gave way to a dawning comprehension, then to a focused, almost intense, professional concentration. His eyes, usually guarded, widened slightly as he processed the document's content. He reread a few lines, then looked up at Eleanor, his gaze now filled with a different kind of understanding. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, his voice hushed. "According to this document, Arthur left everything to you. The house, the business, all properties, all financial accounts. Everything." His words hung in the air, a profound reversal of the previous day's pronouncements. Eleanor nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "That's correct," she confirmed. "The will you read yesterday was a decoy. Arthur wanted them to show their true colors first." She watched Mr. Hayes absorb this, the weight of Arthur's intricate plan settling upon him. Mr. Hayes, ever the meticulous professional, immediately picked up the phone. "I need to verify this, of course. The witnesses, the notary." Blackwood, the other attorney who had helped Arthur with his estate planning. A brief, hushed conversation ensued, filled with legal terms and confirmations. After a few minutes, Mr. Hayes put down the phone, his face solemn. "It's authentic, Mrs. Coleman. This is Arthur's final and binding will. It supersedes all previous documents." "Good," Eleanor said, a quiet satisfaction in her tone. "Now, I'd like you to call Michael. Tell him we need another family meeting. For today, if at all possible." Mr. Hayes looked at her, a newfound respect in his eyes. He nodded, already reaching for his phone. 2 hours later, the familiar trio of Michael, Victoria, and Ethan returned to Mr. Hayes' office. Their annoyance was palpable. Michael's tie was slightly askew, Victoria's usually pristine hair was a little rumpled, and Ethan still looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They had clearly been summoned on short notice, interrupting their grand plans. "What's this about, Mr. Hayes?" Michael demanded, his voice laced with impatience. "We just went through everything yesterday. Is there some kind of minor detail?" He shot a dismissive glance at Eleanor, who sat quietly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. Victoria rolled her eyes. Ethan slumped in his seat, already pulling out his phone. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat, his gaze steady as he addressed the room. "There has been a development," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of his profession. "A second will has been presented, dated more recently than the one we read yesterday. This document supersedes all previous testaments." The change in the room was instantaneous. Michael's face went pale, a sickly white hue spreading across his cheeks. Victoria's expression shifted rapidly from disbelief to a dawning panic, her eyes wide and fixed on Mr. Hayes. Ethan, usually so quick to react, was the last to grasp the implications. He slowly lowered his phone, his youthful features contorting in confusion. "What does that mean?" Michael finally managed to ask, his voice a strained whisper. Mr. Hayes looked directly at them, his voice firm and unwavering. "It means that your grandmother inherits everything. The house, the business, all properties, all financial accounts. They go directly to Eleanor Coleman." A stunned silence filled the room, broken only by the sharp intake of Victoria's breath. Michael was the first to recover, his face flushing crimson. "This can't be right," he exploded, pushing himself forward in his chair. "Dad wouldn't have done this. It's impossible." His voice was tight with anger, disbelief warring with fury. Victoria, her face now a blotchy red, leaned forward, her composure completely shattered. "But Harold promised Robert the business," she protested, her voice shrill. "We've been planning." Her words tumbled out, revealing far more than she intended. Before she caught herself, her hand flying to her mouth, Eleanor, who had been observing them with a quiet intensity, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it cut through the rising tension in the room like a sharp blade. "Planning what?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. For the first time in years, Michael, Victoria, and Ethan looked at her, truly saw her, not as a frail, elderly woman, but as a force to be reckoned with. The tables had turned. The silence in Mr. Hayes' office was deafening, thick with shock and dawning fury. Michael was the first to break it, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Mom," he began, his voice strained but attempting a tone of reason. "Surely you understand this puts everyone in a difficult position. This isn't what Dad would have wanted." He looked at Mr. Hayes, as if seeking confirmation of Eleanor's irrationality. Ethan, emboldened by his father's words, finally found his voice. "Grandma, you can't possibly want to run a construction business. You don't know anything about it." His tone was dismissive, condescending, a clear echo of his parents' long-held belief. Eleanor met his gaze, a glint in her eyes. "You'd be surprised what I know, Ethan." Victoria, her face blotchy, jumped in, her voice rising in pitch. "And the house, Eleanor? It's far too big for one person. You even said yesterday you'd consider your options for downsizing." She waved her hands, recalling Eleanor's calm words from the previous day, now twisting them to suit her own narrative. Eleanor remained seated for a moment longer, allowing their desperate arguments to wash over her. Then, slowly, she rose. The room felt as if it shifted, the power dynamic instantly reorganizing itself around her. She was no longer the grieving widow, the easily dismissed elderly woman. She was the matriarch, the inheritor, the one in control. "I said I'd consider my options," she stated firmly, her voice steady and clear. "I didn't say I'd reached any conclusions." She turned to face them fully, her gaze sweeping over each of their stunned faces. "Arthur knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote this will," she began, her voice gaining strength with each word. "He knew what you really thought of me. He heard you, you know. He heard you discussing senior communities at his own breakfast table, planning to sell our home, divide our things, even before he was cold in his bed." Their faces went from shock to a sickly pale as the weight of her words landed. She continued, "This will isn't just about money, Michael. Or the house, Victoria. It's about respect, something you never thought I deserved." The confrontation in Mr. Hayes' office concluded with no real resolution for Michael's family, only a stark, undeniable reality. Desperate, they followed Eleanor home, trailing behind her car like a pack of lost wolves. They stood on her porch, their faces a mixture of desperation, anger, and a simmering resentment. Eleanor, however, did not invite them in. She simply unlocked her door and walked inside, leaving them to stand on the cold wood, the autumn wind rustling through the fallen leaves around them. After a long moment of stunned silence, Michael pushed the door open, following her in, Victoria and Ethan trailing behind. Inside the familiar living room, Victoria began to pace, her movements agitated. Harold was sick. "Eleanor," she insisted, her voice tight with barely contained fury. He wasn't thinking clearly. He would never have done this. Ethan, still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of their loss, repeated his earlier dismissal. "But Grandma, you don't understand business. How can you run a construction company?" Eleanor sat on the sofa, perfectly composed, watching them. The silence stretched, thick with their accusations and her quiet resolve. Then, she dropped the first bombshell. "You're right, Ethan," she said, her voice calm, almost conversational. "I don't just understand the business." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I've been doing the books for that company for 15 years. Victoria gasped, a sharp, choked sound. Michael stared, utterly dumbfounded. Eleanor continued, her gaze steady. "Every night, after dinner, while Arthur relaxed, I was in the study. I handled all the accounting, the payroll, the tax preparations, the client billing. Since 2008, all of it." "That's impossible," Victoria whispered, her face ashen. "Harold never mentioned it. Never once." "Why would he?" Eleanor retorted, a dry amusement in her tone. "He knew you wouldn't take a frail old woman seriously. But he valued my work. I was the one who suggested the bidding strategy for the city contract last year, the one that secured us the biggest project in decades." I was the one who caught that accounting error that saved us nearly $12,000 just 6 months ago. Michael, his face pale, finally found his voice. Why didn't you ever say anything, Mom? The question was tinged with accusation, as if her silence was a personal affront. Eleanor looked at him, a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. When would I have said it, Michael? During the family dinners where you discussed my future as if I wasn't there? When you dismissed my opinions on anything beyond the household budget? Or perhaps when Victoria was planning to put me in the cheapest facility she could find? She reached for a thick, unmarked folder from the coffee table, a folder they had never seen before. She opened it, revealing neatly organized documents, financial statements, and investment portfolios. This, she announced, sliding it across the table, is the real financial picture of Arthur's extensive investments. The ones I managed, of course. Victoria snatched up the documents, her eyes scanning the figures. A gasp escaped her lips. This can't be right, she whispered again, the confidence completely drained from her voice. The numbers were far larger, the investments far more diversified than they had ever imagined. Ethan, lost and bewildered, looked at Eleanor. So, Grandma, he mumbled, what are you going to do? Eleanor smiled, a genuine, powerful smile. I'm going to live, Ethan. Really live. Michael, still clinging to some shred of his former certainty, tried to argue. But you can't manage a whole construction business by yourself, Mom. It's too much. Oh, I won't be managing it alone, Eleanor stated, her voice dismissive. I'll be hiring a professional management company. They'll handle the day-to-day operations. Victoria's voice became shrill, raw with panic. Strangers? You'd hire strangers instead of keeping it in the family? After everything, Eleanor's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glare. Family? She retorted, her voice cutting. When have any of you treated me like family? Since Arthur got sick, you've seen me as a burden, an obstacle. You've always been a family of 3, she said, picking up an old framed photo from the side table, one of Michael, Victoria, and a young Ethan smiling brightly, tolerating the 2 old people who inconveniently remained in your way. She placed the photo back down, her gaze sweeping over them one last time. You were going to warehouse me in the cheapest facility you could find, Eleanor concluded, her voice devoid of warmth. Now, you will learn what it feels like to be treated the way you treated me. The next morning, Eleanor's phone buzzed incessantly. Michael called twice, Victoria 3 times, their messages growing increasingly desperate and frantic. A text from Ethan popped up, simply asking for money. Eleanor let the calls go to voicemail, deleted Ethan's text without reading it. She was done. The time for them to be heard was over. Now it was her turn to act. Later that week, Michael showed up at her door with a bouquet of grocery store flowers, his face carefully composed. He began with a long, rambling apology, blaming misunderstandings and stress for their behavior. Eleanor listened politely, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. It was too late. Her decisions were already made, firm and unyielding, just as Arthur had intended. She remembered his words, spoken on one of those quiet evenings, anticipating this very outcome. They only see what they want to see, Eleanor. We're invisible to them unless we're useful. Let's see how they handle it when we're the only ones who matter. Back in Mr. Hayes's office, Eleanor signed a stack of papers, each stroke of her pen solidifying Arthur's vision, turning their shared plan into a legal reality. She had already made contact with David Miller, Arthur's longtime foreman, a good man who had always treated her with courtesy and respect, unlike her own son. She sold him the construction business, ensuring that Arthur's legacy of hard work and integrity would continue under capable hands, not be dismantled by Michael's greed. The rental properties and the substantial investment accounts, however, she decided to keep, hiring a professional management company to handle their oversight. She was ready to enjoy the fruits of their labor, not simply hand them over. Then came the next step. Through Mr. Hayes, Eleanor delivered a formal 30-day notice to Michael and Victoria. The message was stark. Their house, still legally in Arthur's name, was now Eleanor's. They had exactly 1 month to either purchase it from her at market value or move out. Within an hour, Michael's call came, his voice thick with fury. "Mom, you can't be serious. This is our home. You can't just kick us out." "It's Arthur's house, Michael," Eleanor corrected him calmly. "And now it's mine. Just like the will states." A pause on the other end, then a strained admission. "We can't afford to buy it, Mom." "You know we can't. Why are you doing this to us?" "I'm not doing anything to you, Michael," Eleanor replied, her voice firm, devoid of emotion. "I'm simply doing what I need to do for myself. Arthur worked hard for everything we have. It was always meant to be for our future, not for you to take for granted," she added, a hint of steel in her tone. "Families should treat each other with respect and kindness. Perhaps this will help you remember that." She ended the call before he could protest further. The next few weeks were a relentless barrage of desperate attempts from Michael's family to change her mind. Victoria, suddenly a doting daughter-in-law, appeared with old photo albums, tearfully reminiscing about good times, trying to guilt Eleanor into submission. Ethan, likely prompted by his parents, even produced a surprisingly well-written apology letter, filled with flowery sentiments that felt entirely out of character for him. Eleanor accepted the albums and the letter, but her resolve remained unshaken. Michael, growing more desperate, brought his accountant to argue figures. Then Mr. Thompson, a lawyer known for his aggressive tactics. Mr. Thompson tried to threaten her, insinuating claims of diminished capacity if she didn't reconsider. Eleanor simply smiled. "Mr. Thompson," she stated, her voice unwavering, "I've been making rational decisions for 70 years. I managed Arthur's company books for 15, and I'm quite capable of managing my own affairs now. In fact, now I'm making them for myself." Mr. Hayes later informed Eleanor that Michael had indeed attempted to contest the will. "The case is exceptionally weak, Mrs. Coleman," he assured her. "Arthur's competence was well documented, and the witnesses to the final will are beyond reproach. They don't have a leg to stand on." The house sold quickly, its market value a stark reminder of what Michael and Victoria had lost. They were forced into a small, cramped 2-bedroom apartment, with Ethan relegated to sleeping on the couch in the living room. It was a stark contrast to the spacious home they had once taken for granted. Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace, not guilt, about their reduced circumstances. She spent her days planning, not just for her own future, but for ways to honor Arthur's true legacy. She traveled, took up hobbies she had long postponed, and rediscovered the joy of simple pleasures. The desperate calls and visits from Michael, Victoria, and Ethan gradually stopped. The silence, at first unnerving, became a quiet comfort. Eleanor understood then, with a clarity that stung but also freed her. Sometimes, the people who claim to love you are the ones who hurt you the most. She had given them every chance to be family, and they had chosen greed. As she settled into her new life, a new thought began to form. She realized she still had one more decision to make, one final act to truly cement Arthur's legacy and ensure that their values, not their children's greed, would ultimately prevail. 6 months had passed since Arthur's funeral, 6 months that felt like a lifetime of transformation. Eleanor was in her new townhouse, a space that felt entirely her own. She moved through the bright, airy kitchen, making her morning coffee, the aroma filling the room. The old house, with its sprawling rooms and the bittersweet memories of feeling invisible, had been sold. This townhouse reflected her choices, her independence, a deliberate step away from a past where her presence had been overlooked. The soft chime of the doorbell interrupted her peaceful morning. She opened it to find Michael on her porch. He looked older, not just in years, but in spirit. The sharp edges of certainty and entitlement had been replaced by something softer, a hint of humility in his eyes. He hesitated, taking in her appearance, her comfortable home, and the quiet flourishing of her new life. "You look good, Mom," he said, genuine surprise in his voice. Eleanor smiled, a real, unforced smile. "I feel good, Michael." He stepped inside, awkward at first, then found a seat. The air was thick with unspoken apologies and past hurts. Finally, he looked at her, his gaze steady. "We were wrong, Mom," he admitted, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "Not just about the money, but about you. About what you meant to Dad. About everything." He explained how the abrupt shift in their lives, moving into a small apartment, had forced him to reconsider many things. He also mentioned talking to David Miller, who had purchased Arthur's construction business. David, with his usual straightforward honesty, had revealed Eleanor's significant and often unseen contributions to Arthur's company. "He called you Dad's secret weapon." "Mom," Michael said, shaking his head slightly. "Said he couldn't have managed half the things he did without your eye for detail." "Your numbers." Eleanor looked at him, a poignant question in her eyes. "If Arthur had told you all of this, would you have listened, Michael?" They both knew the answer was no. They had been too caught up in their own narratives, their own assumptions, to truly hear. Michael's eyes scanned the room, noticing the small details of her new existence. Photos from her recent travels adorned a shelf, vibrant colors reflecting new adventures. Certificates from art classes and gardening workshops were neatly framed, evidence of a life beyond simply being a wife or a mother. He saw a woman who was living, truly living, for herself. "Are you happy, Mom?" he asked, the question laced with a genuine curiosity she hadn't heard from him in years. Eleanor met his gaze. "Yes," she confirmed, her voice soft but firm. "For the first time in years, I'm genuinely happy." She paused, then clarified. "I didn't do any of this to punish you, Michael. I did it to save myself, to build a life where I am seen, and where I am respected." They talked for over an hour, a conversation unlike any they had shared in decades. Michael spoke about his new job, which, while not as grand as running his father's company, was steady and less stressful. He mentioned Victoria had found work too, something she hadn't done in years. Ethan, he admitted, was still adjusting but was actively seeking steady work, the shock of their changed circumstances forcing him to grow up. As he prepared to leave, Michael paused at the door. He turned to Eleanor, a hesitant look on his face. Then, he simply reached out and pulled her into a hug. It was the first genuine embrace in years. Not a perfunctory pat, but a real, heartfelt squeeze. "Could you maybe," he mumbled into her shoulder, "come to just family dinner sometime? No fuss, just us." Eleanor returned the hug, a small warmth spreading through her chest. "I'd like that, Michael," she said, and for the first time, she truly meant it. Her calendar was now full, not with obligations, but with chosen activities and friends who saw her clearly, who valued her opinions, and cherished her company. She had rediscovered forgotten passions, learned new skills, and forged new connections. Eleanor often reflected on Arthur's true gift. It wasn't just the money, or the business, or the property. It was the permission to value herself, to understand that respect isn't something you earn through endless sacrifice, but something you claim, something you demand from those who would diminish you. She now saw herself clearly, not just as Arthur's widow, or Michael's mother, or Ethan's grandmother, but as Eleanor Coleman, a woman with her own identity, her own strengths, her own worth. The woman who, only 6 months ago, Victoria had whispered, should have been buried with her husband, was very much alive. Perhaps, for the first time in years, she was truly living. This profound self-discovery, this reclaiming of her own life and identity, was, she knew, the greatest inheritance of all.